even if someone can feel that someone cares and is interested and wants to talk when they're ready, that in itself can make a huge difference. So I guess my first bit of practical advice here would be to not be afraid of broaching it. Don't be afraid of asking or putting that flare out to see how someone's doing.
Hello, and welcome back. This is the final episode of the first series of the Straight Talking Doctor podcast. Before we get going, I just wanted to take 2 seconds to say how incredibly grateful I am for everyone who has listened so far. Your feedback has been phenomenal. I've loved every second of recording the first series, but you guys have really motivated me to come back bigger and better than ever for series 2. I've got lots of incredible guests lined up. I can't wait to keep having these conversations, lifting the lid on mental health, and hopefully empowering you guys with some useful tools that you can all use to improve your health and happiness. My guest this week is Dr. Kieran Kennedy, a consultant psychiatrist and TV doctor based in Sydney, Australia. I originally connected with Kieran during lockdown and found that his Instagram post quickly became a really useful source of knowledge and advice for helping me deal with the challenges of the pandemic. He's a keen fitness enthusiast and avid writer, having featured in things like Men's Health, GC and Vice. And if you're based in Australia, you may have seen him on the big screen as he's a co-host on Ticker Health and regularly stars as guest expert on different Australian news channels. During the conversation, we delve into the concept of toxic masculinity and what we can do more to challenge this in today's society, the potential upcoming advances in mental health treatments, and how we can look after ourselves when our external world becomes stressful or difficult. I made sure to quiz Kieran for as many useful tips on how we can look after our mental health, and he certainly did not disappoint. Kieran, thank you so much for joining me today. Welcome to the podcast. It's been a little while since we organised this, and I'm absolutely delighted to sit down and finally get a chance to have a chat with you.
Yeah, no, me too, mate. Thank you so much for having me. And as you say, it's not easy coordinating between the UK and Australia, is it? So we've done well to finally find a time that suits.
Especially with medical schedules and rotas and things, definitely makes things a bit harder. So let's get straight into it. What sparked your interest in psychiatry and mental health?
Yeah, the good question. Well, I've always been sort of more on the artistic side in some ways. Like before I became a bio nerd and decided I wanted to be a doctor and go to med school and all those things, I actually did a lot of writing, reading, bit of even performance kind of stuff, music. So I think for me, when I found psychology and then psychiatry, it just really clicked with me because psychiatry is kind of it's a science, obviously, and I'll defend that until the cows come home. But it's also a bit of an art, and I think I just really like that psychiatry is a little bit more fluid. It's a little bit more grey, dealing with really complex things that can't just be kind of looked at through a number of a test result or kind of squared away really easily. So I think for me, the complexity of psychiatry and the kind of the mixture of art and science is what drew me to it. I actually did a psychology degree before I decided to punish myself with some more years of study and go to medical school. So yeah, I always knew kind of right from that first Psychology 101 class that mental health and the brain and the mind were what really got me going. And so kind of when I decided I wanted to do medical school, psychiatry was the sort of the natural progression. So it feels a bit crazy to be sitting here now actually doing it. So,
and the clinical side is something obviously that you enjoy and you practice at the moment, but you've been opening yourself up to another side really. And can you touch on that for us?
Yeah, so obviously clinical medicine and psychiatry is my first love, and that's what I'll always do in some form or some part of my week. But yeah, you're right, mate. I think the last few years I've been lucky enough to sort of fall in love with a little bit of a different side of medicine as well, which I know you and I have talked and frothed over this together at times. You feel the same, but you know, when it comes to medicine, I think there's this whole other world of advocacy, sharing information, getting facts across, myth busting and things, and whether that's on social media or in the media or writing for a few different places. I really enjoy that. And so I've been doing quite a bit of that the last few years as well. And that's included sort of morning TV. Over here in Australia, I do a wee bit of that to go on and chat about men's health topics or mental health topics. I write for Men's Health magazine and get to do really fun things like come on and waffle with you on this podcast, mate. So, no, I just really love kind of, especially for mental health, I really love just kind of advocating around it and getting some facts out there in a sort of a non-stodgy, non-confronting way, because I think for a long time, psychiatry especially has just been very kind of not within the mainstream, if you like. And I think we really need to be pushing more of this from a factual medical kind of basis in the media and wider platforms. So, that's kind of kept me busy for the last few years alongside working at the hospital and things.
Yeah, as if you weren't busy enough already. But like you say, it's absolutely great to see someone else in the healthcare space who wants to do a similar thing and try and advocate and push their message and what they have learned to as many different people as possible. And I guess that's why I was drawn to your Instagram. For the people listening with the sharp ears, you may hear Kieran doesn't have an English accent. It's actually, I think, New Zealand, if I'm right, after our first conversation.
Correct.
I fell for the trap that Kieran lives in Australia, but it actually has a Kiwi accent.
Very confusing.
Yeah, it's been amazing being able to connect with someone who is down under and be able to have these sort of conversations and learn from each other and further each other's sort of message.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, and I've really loved what you're doing as well, Mark. And like you say, that I think that's why kind of just over socials we sort of clicked and we're interested in advocating for the same thing. And I think especially when it comes to men's health, and then especially again when it comes to mental health and psychiatry, we've just got such a long way to go in kind of getting info out there and banging back on stigma and things. So chats like this and spaces like this are what really get me excited about medicine, actually, because I think we can do so much good within the hospital, but if you think about the impact that a piece of writing or a little TV talk or a podcast might have in terms of getting out there to people who need it, that's a really motivating thing. So, no, I'm definitely loving it so far.
Absolutely. You can suddenly increase that reach and that ability to do good to a much wider audience. And I think that's quite a special thing to be able to do. So if you don't follow Kieran, I'd fully recommend it. It's Dr. Kieran Kennedy, I believe the tag is on Instagram. And if you look at his Instagram, he tackles big topics on mental health, but actually his content is underpinned by an in-depth knowledge of psychiatry. And he helps to simplify some fairly complex subject matter. So really worth a read. There are a lot of, inverted commas, experts on social media, but it is refreshing to have someone who practices as a basically fully qualified psychiatrist to talk about, wellness and mental health. I'm really interested, Kieran, to know how much crossover is there between the topics that you talk about online and the day-to-day interactions that you have with your actual patients?
I really love that question, actually, Mark, because it's an interesting one. I think a lot of the topics surrounding mental health that we do talk about in the social media space, in the media space, and kind of in the general public, a lot of those topics and avenues are things that do come up in clinic and in the hospital every day. So, depression, anxiety, struggling with identity, relationships, breakups, job changes, city changes. These are things that psychiatry registrars and psychiatrists are seeing people about and talking to people about every single day. And so I do really love kind of getting those topics out there from a place, as you say, hopefully, of some evidence-based psychiatry and clinical kind of experience. But, I also really enjoy getting the topics out there that maybe the public don't get to hear or see about too much, because I think it's really important to acknowledge that some of the glossier kind of mental health stuff we see on social media and online and on TV segments and things, it can be quite separate from that public mental health and psychiatry, where we're talking about severe schizophrenia, where we're talking about people struggling with homelessness, severe trauma, and really kind of intense things that I think for a long time, the wider public have shied away from in some ways, if that's the right term, and I understand why, but I think it's important that we're balancing these things. Obviously depression, anxiety, adjustment disorders, these are our high prevalence things. But, psychiatry for a public psychiatrist at least is very much also, psychosis and severe addiction and severe trauma, self-harm, suicide. And so, like I say, I always try and balance it, but with the kind of the advocacy work I do try to kind of get that side of psychiatry out there a little bit more as well, because, I think it's important that people know that, pushing, going for a run or working on your diet or doing some mindfulness each day, that is really, really important for us to look after our mental health. But it's also really important that we acknowledge for some people, severe mental health conditions or severe struggles are things that do require that more in-depth kind of level of care and support and medication at times. So, yeah, it's a bit of a balance, but as you say, mate, I try and kind of show a bit of realness to things, and I try my best to kind of put quite complex, at times quite confronting topics in kind of relatable, simple ways that don't have people turn away from them, because I think that's been part of the stigma around psychiatry and mental health for a long time too. It's kind of been this, oh, that's really intense or emotional, or maybe at times quite confronting. And so I don't want to see that or hear about that. But it's important that we all see and hear and talk about these things, because health is mental health. And so if we're on this mission to bring psychiatry and mental health into the mainstream more, then we need to be kind of balancing those things.
That's a great answer. Trauma is something that came up there, and I just want to touch on trauma. And you sort of classed it in the side of things that you were talking about with hospital patients there, and it's severe trauma you're dealing with, and the fallout from that. But I think we hear a lot about trauma on social media, particularly now, that it affects everyone, and it affects everyone in a different way, and it's a bit of a spectrum, really. And it's like your sort of relation with trauma can therefore affect how you are put together in the way that your mental health works. Can you touch a little bit on trauma for us, and maybe, I don't know, explain how you deal with that with your hospital patients, and what the difference is, or is there any difference with people online and how they discuss trauma?
Yeah, I think that's such a great question, and such an important one to put across, mate. You're right. I think our sort of more traditional or older definition of trauma was very much driven by diagnostic kind of manuals and the DSM or the ICD and things, who, in older times, they classified trauma as sort of those severe physical or sexual abuse cases, or obvious kind of overt trauma. But we know now that trauma can occur in many, many different forms. It can be psychological, emotional, physical, and you're exactly right there. These days we look at trauma not as something that people either have or don't have, but as a bit of a spectrum, and I think you'd be hard pressed to find anyone who doesn't have some form of difficulty or some form of trauma in their background. And again, that's on a very different spectrum for different people, and we're not comparing traumas here or weighing them up on a scale. For some people, that might be really horrific physical abuse or trauma. For other people, that might be the more subtle emotional type trauma within past relationships or family systems. And I think the fascinating thing about psychiatry is that all of those things come into the picture when you're helping support someone with whatever their mental struggles are. And I think especially when we're going through difficult times that are stressful, there's a lot of change, they're confronting, like the pandemic, for example. I think our past kind of patterns and traumas and ways of relating with the world and others, those have been kind of stressed and pushed. And I think a lot of people have been talking about trauma more online, you're right, because we've really kind of had to confront our own sort of trauma more because of what we're all kind of going through at the moment. So Yeah, I absolutely think it's a spectrum, and I absolutely think it's important that people know that you don't have to feel that your quote unquote trauma is at a certain point to warrant reaching out for support or talking through that or seeing someone for, because that's a bit of a myth from the past. I think that trauma has to be a certain severity or level to be worthwhile sort of incorporating into your care.
Yeah, you raise a few interesting points there regarding trauma, and that for me is the biggest sort of take home I've had with trauma, and even looking at myself and the people around me and working out, you know, trauma doesn't have to be severe, and you can still have long lasting effects, and your personality can be massively changed or shaped by the trauma you have. And other people may experience that trauma or may have experienced that trauma and not have any lasting effects. And that's fascinating. And once you understand that, it makes it a little bit easier to work out, different quirks in your own personality, particularly why we act in certain ways. It's absolutely fundamental to, I think, a lot of the behaviors that we have.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to point out as well that, what might be traumatic for one person may not necessarily be traumatic for another person. And that can depend on our upbringing, our biology, our genetics, our early family systems. But, particularly in recent years, there's been so much going on, and we've been talking about trauma a lot more. And I think it's important to say that what might be traumatic for you might not be for your next door neighbor. And so that doesn't mean that it's less worthy or that people should feel guilty or shamed about being triggered by something or struggling with something, because, we're all an extremely unique kind of mental makeup of genetics, biology, life history, early relationships, our experiences. And, for me, that's the fascinating part about psychiatry as well. Just as you say, Mark, two people can go through the exact same thing and come out with very, very different kind of mindsets and mental sequelae of that. And two people can go through two very different things but end up in a very similar position mental health wise. So it's fascinating, but it's about all of us kind of leaning into the fact that it's uncomfortable, especially in medicine, I think, to have grey areas and to have things not neatly kind of tied off into diagnostic manuals or test results or boxes. But, psychiatry is very fluid and at times it's very grey. And I actually think that's what's beautiful about it. And if we embrace that more, I think it can actually leave us all feeling a lot less guilty and ashamed when it comes to what we might be struggling with, because there's no rule book here.
Yeah, fully agree. And the greyness, I think, transcends just mental health. And it actually, when we look further into sort of, health in general, particularly nutrition science and things like that, there is so many grey areas. And I think we have a tendency as people and a population society to want to know what the diagnosis is, want to know the exact answer. And sometimes that doesn't always fit. We're finding out more and more with emerging science that it's not always as simple as that. And when we have an understanding that there is some woolly sides to things, there is some greyness, it can actually help. It can help you understand the problem that you have. And therefore, as a result of that, you can understand that there are different treatments, or it's not always as simple as taking this one specific pill or doing this one specific thing to fix it. There is tons and tons of, of different possibilities relating to that fact.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, mate. And I think the great thing about that is that it's I think it allows us to be a little bit kinder to ourselves and a little bit kinder to others as well when we don't kind of box it off so much. I think when we lean into the fact that this is a bit grey, as you say, it can be a bit woolly sometimes in terms of there's no clear cutoffs here. I think it just helps us all lean into being a little bit more compassionate towards ourselves and to those around us, because we've all got a history, to be a bit cliche, we've all got baggage in some form. Some might be heavier than others and in different types of bags for sure. But, no one is completely struggle free, and everyone has mental health and everyone has mental struggles. And that's a big part of the message that I kind of love pushing as well. And so I think leaning into the fact that this is kind of messy and complex and grey, I think actually really helps that rather than hinders that, because it just means we stop being so kind of controlled and trying to label everything and, as you say, find the exact answer and the exact treatment. And we just lean into the fact that this is messy and sometimes there's no completely right answer or completely right treatment. And that can actually be a beautiful thing in some ways.
Yeah, and some people may feel that their baggage is heavier than someone else. That they might not be, but it's how you respond to that baggage. And I guess that's just touching on what we were saying before. And we all need a little bit more self-compassion, don't we? If we all employed a little bit of that self-compassion to ourselves, we would all be in a much better place. We're often at fault for being too harsh on ourselves. I know particularly as medics we are, but the vast proportion of the population, I think, is very hard on themselves. So I think that's fantastic advice. I'm not going to go too much into the pandemic because it feels like it's never ending. And I know it is over in Australia. We're recording this on the 9th of January and it never seems to end. But I will touch on something in terms of trauma that you just mentioned. What do you think the fallout will be from the pandemic in terms of mental health?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's going to be a big fallout for years, if not decades to come. I think the fascinating and slightly terrifying thing about mental health and its impacts is that the impacts often come later. So I know in many countries around the world, the UK and Australia included, we've been talking about, but right now there's not an increase in suicide rates, for example, or right now the mental health statistics are this or that. But I think what we know as psychiatry doctors is that the fallout of stressful events and events like this can be far-reaching, and it can often catch up with us a bit later. So I really do think that those big bang diagnoses, the common ones like depression, anxiety, types of trauma responses and impacts are going to rise significantly, and they have been over the pandemic. We've seen especially young people and young adults be hit really hard by this. So, for example, the hospital I've been working at, there's been a big increase in the city in young people presenting with distress, suicidal thoughts, self-harm. And I think that just points to the fact that a lot of people are really struggling with the constant change and uncertainty, the isolation and everything that the pandemic's brought. So, I think we are going to be seeing impacts for a long time. But, I always like to spin it with a bit of an optimistic tagline too. And if anything, the silver lining of the pandemic, I think, or I hope, is that we're going to keep having discussions like this more, and the really beautiful thing I've seen in the last 2 years is that we have been talking about mental health more. People have been coming out and talking about the ways that this has impacted them. We've had actors and musicians and elite sports people coming out and talking about their diagnoses and medications. And, I think one of the positive things is that this has really kind of leveled a lot of us, and it's shown that we all, again, just as we've been saying, we all struggle in some way, and that it's okay to struggle, especially when something like this has been happening. It's not weird or abnormal or faulty if you've fallen into a depression or your anxiety's really shot up over the last year or two. It's actually a very normal human response in some ways, and it's nothing to be ashamed of or guilty about.
Yeah, completely agree. I think there was a sort of slow awakening in terms of mental health happening, and I guess the pandemic has been like injecting a ton of steroids into that.
Yeah.
People have really started to take ownership and responsibility for their health, and particularly mental health. And as a consequence of that, we do tend to talk about it more. I'm starting a whole goddamn podcast on mental health. Perhaps I wouldn't have done that before. I wouldn't have started my Instagram page without the pandemic. I felt like I had to step up and do something more.
Yep.
So, just as a little microcosm there, in my instance, I'm trying to spread my message through, as a result of the pandemic. So that is the flip side. I love the fact you're flipping it positive, despite the fact, yeah, of course, there is going to be fallout for many a year, I feel as well. One of the things I think is spoken about more now, thank God, is toxic masculinity.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to know from a psychiatrist, what is toxic masculinity and how damaging is it?
Yeah, really, really important question. And I do talk about this quite a lot over in Australia. There's some pretty rigid ideas about masculinity and manhood everywhere, but, particularly in New Zealand, where I grew up, and in Australia, those can be, pretty rock solid sometimes. So, toxic masculinity, and I want to point out actually first off that toxic masculinity isn't actually a term that I'm a big fan of, to be honest, because I think it's kind of one of these terms that has been thrown out there and it's taken on a bit of a life of its own. And I think it's important to call out that we are not talking about men or masculinity or manhood being toxic or inherently wrong, or we're not talking about one type of masculinity being the good type or the non-toxic type, and the other type of masculinity being, bad, toxic, dangerous, wrong. We are talking about a social construct. That's what masculinity and femininity are for the most part. It's a social construct in terms of how men sort of feel that they need to act in society to show that they are men and have masculinity. And when we're talking about toxic masculinity, we're talking about elements of that which are unhealthy for men themselves, for women, and for communities at large. So an example of something that might be wedged within more toxic types of masculinity would be the belief that men don't show emotion, or men need to suck it up and never cry or show any weakness. Or it might be that men need to display physical dominance and control over other people if they're going to be masculine and manly. And those are two examples because we know that those two behaviors and ideas are linked to poorer health outcomes mentally and physically for men and for women and for the communities around those men. So when we're talking about toxic masculinity, we're talking about parts of masculinity that society has placed onto men that are not so helpful when it comes to their health and the health of the world around them.
It's a great explanation. And I agree. I guess I hadn't really thought of it in that sense. And I guess as you talk about it quite a lot, you probably get some heat from people that say, why are you calling men toxic? And I think the way you describe it there, toxic types of masculinity, just gives it enough detail that kind of makes a little bit more sense and would probably prevent people feeling like they were being attacked from the term. I don't know if you agree on that.
Yeah, no, that's definitely in line with my thoughts there as well, mate. And I think it's really, really important. I think especially for men to feel like, it's not the man himself that is toxic or wrong. So much of masculinity and femininity, if we actually pull it apart, is a small amount of biology and genetics in terms of what makes a man act like a man and what makes a woman or someone who is identifying with a feminine gender act feminine. And most of these constructs are actually societally built. So I act, or whoever it is, acts masculine, not because of this thing in my brain that says it's weak if men cry. That is a social construct that we've picked up as children through watching other men, or little conscious or subconscious cues we've picked up from the environment. And so it's an important point to call out, because I think if we make men feel sort of attacked or ashamed, we know that making someone feel shame is actually doing the opposite when it comes to behavior change. If you make someone feel ashamed or attacked for their behavior, then it actually makes them less likely to engage in different types of behaviors or health behaviors to put themselves in a better position mental health wise. So yeah, you're absolutely right, mate. I always like to point out that this is not about men being inherently toxic or bad or wrong. This is about the social construct and parts of what men are pushed to sort of be and do being not so healthy for them and for those around them sometimes.
So on that note of behaviour change and ensuring people don't feel shamed so that they are more likely to change their behaviour, how do we go about dismantling or overcoming toxic types of masculinity?
Yeah, and that's the $1 million question, isn't it? I wish I had a banging, just straightforward answer for this one, but it's tough because, like you say, I think any of these social constructions, they are really complex and they take a long time to change because it comes from society and culture around us. So I think that the first step is discussions exactly like this, mate. I think it's discussions around what modern manhood and modern masculinity is and isn't. It's about brothers, modeling different behavior for younger brothers. It's about fathers raising sons in a slightly different way. It's about even simple things like telling young boys, that it's okay to be upset or cry, or that it's not kind of weak if if you're not telling a young boy, boys don't cry. I think it's us slowly as men and as women as well, changing the narrative around what masculinity and femininity are or have to be. And I think a lot of that comes from men starting to feel more comfortable to kind of step out of those shackles, if you'll call it that, in a dramatic way, and sort of show that they can be vulnerable, they can show emotion, they don't have to be sort of, for example, physically aggressive or dominant to still be masculine or a man.
Yeah, it's really difficult, isn't it? Like you say, it's a tough question to answer because it is so ingrained in our society. But absolutely, I think we are making small, minor steps forward. Do you have anything else that, if you ever see an example of toxic masculinity, so for anyone that is feeling a little bit like they don't know how to approach that, is there the right way to go about, approaching it? Do you approach it? Is there a conversation or a line of conversation that you can take with someone that you've seen work in your experience?
Yeah, again, I think that can be really tricky, and I think when we're thinking about being out with mates or being out with the lads, I think we can all kind of readily pick up examples of things that kind of fall into those really stereotypical kind of, oh, harden up, mate, or, that kind of stuff. And obviously a lot of that is just banter, but there's a bit of a layer underneath that as well that kind of reinforces a lot of these things. I think if guys or anyone really is noticing some examples of this, it would just be, like you say, in a relaxed way, pointing it out. And I think that's easier if it's more overt. I think if it's kind of, for example, maybe more misogynist or kind of sexist attitudes towards women, I think a lot of men now are kind of okay with calling that out to their mates. But, if it's the more subtle stuff, it can be really difficult. And, in my personal and professional life, I think one of the ways that I've kind of gone about it or talked to patients or people about going about it is to kind of be the change that you want to see, and kind of modeling that for our family units and our mates and those type of things. So it's about not being afraid, I guess, to lean into asking mates how they're doing, for example, or being open with mates about maybe struggling right now, or talking about kind of more touchy-feely things. I think the more we model these things and lean into being vulnerable ourselves, the more that shows men around us that it's okay to do the same, because you're still a lad and you still got masculinity and you're still a man if you're doing those things. So yeah, I think kind of leading from yourself is a good way to go about kind of changing some of these things.
Yeah, I love the point about being brave, because it's hard, isn't it? You're being
Yep.
out with your mates. We've all heard and been part of discussions. I think, looking at my own sort of personal experience, we definitely have come on as a friendship group, even in the last 5 years, 3 years, 2 years probably. So that we call out anything that, or we try to call out as much as possible that we are aware of, around us, and trying to set that example. But that's not always been the case. And I think we have moved on as society. And I think it's hard to sometimes take personal responsibility or collective responsibility for the fact that maybe, at certain points we have been privy to not standing up or even making comments yourself. And I think it's okay to take responsibility for that. because if you don't change. And that can be
Absolutely.
hard. And I think a lot of people do find that hard. But the more of us that step up and do that, the more we will question and challenge and try to dismantle any of these sort of negative social constructs that we have, particularly with regards to toxic types of masculinity.
100%.
I just want to change tack a little bit here. We've been advancing in modern medicine, treating physical illness over the last 30, 40 years. There's been tons of advances in so many different areas. I've not seen a lot of movement with medications or treatments for mental health conditions. And I think generally there is a feeling that our mental health has gotten worse. So I guess there's two elements to this question. Why have we not seen many advances? And secondly, why is our mental health getting worse?
Yeah, such good points there, mate. And you're right. There was this big explosion kind of 50, 60, even 70 years ago now with our most basic psychiatric medications. And in a lot of ways, most of those medications are still exactly the same, or they're the same class of medication at least. And that's just an example of, as you say, how difficult it is, I think, to find biological and medication-based treatments to treat conditions of the mind. But I think it's also a bit of a flavor or a blowback to the fact that for a long time now, mental health and psychiatry, and I'll get on my soapbox a little bit here, have come second to talking and thinking about physical health. And again, not to jar anyone, not to prod any of my surgical colleagues or anything like that, but I think within medicine itself, psychiatry for a long, long time now has kind of been the area of medicine where not a whole lot of attention and even funding has gone to. There are some really kind of dire but interesting statistics, for example, showing how much funding mental health and psychiatry gets as a specialty around the world compared to other areas of medicine. And so I think it's been a bit of a combo of it's really difficult to find treatments that are effective for mental health conditions. We have some fantastic ones now that really, really work, but you're right, we're kind of waiting for those next advances. They are coming. We're investigating new medications. We're looking into psychedelics and a whole host of new avenues. But yeah, I think it's been this combo of waiting for the next kind of explosion of treatments to be discovered, but also kind of us needing to catch up in terms of actual attention and funding and time being put more on mental health.
Can I just quickly touch on psychedelics there? Really interesting. They were around in the 50s and 60s. They were used a little bit and then they were banned quite quickly. If you look down into any sort of US history, the war on drugs and things and Nixon, you'll see sort of some of the reasons why they were sort of hushed away, and no research has been done on them. But there is a new avenue, and there are a lot of people very excited about the potential of psychedelics in psychiatry. What's your thoughts on this? What's your understanding of what's coming? And, are you excited to see that side of things?
Yeah, I think this is really one of the areas that obviously the public are hearing more about, but especially within medicine and psychiatry, where we're really kind of looking at this with wide open eyes and quite a lot of excitement, because as we've just said, for a long time, we really haven't had any major new areas of treatment, particularly kind of medication-based treatment, coming into the play for mental illness. And there are some really good, promising sort of results from some of these studies. And I think it's important to point out that at the moment it's very much in the study phase for a lot of things. But for example, ketamine is being used for severe depression and different conditions, and that's actually showing a lot of benefit for a lot of people, and that's actually being used in different places around the world, and in some areas quite a lot right now. So, it's very exciting. I think that we're starting to explore these avenues again after so long having them kind of fully off the table for various often very political reasons. And I think it just offers a lot of hope for a lot of people who have not sort of as of yet found an avenue or a medication that's really worked for them. And for a lot of people, the studies are showing that in certain forms and for certain conditions, they are really, really helpful. So watch this space, but it's definitely exciting for a sort of a baby psychiatrist like myself to see this kind of coming onto the floor.
Yeah, what a dream to have, hopefully during your time as a consultant psychiatrist, a plethora of different treatments come through that may give you different avenues to treat, particularly treatment-resistant depression and diseases that we really struggle to treat with our current arsenal of treatments at the moment. So yeah, it's fantastic.
Absolutely.
I want to touch on something a little bit sensitive here. And it's the topic of suicide, because I think these days so many of us have been, indirectly or directly sort of affected by knowing someone that has, committed suicide, or you hear about it in your circles so often, and particularly with our interest in men's health. 3/4 of suicides are men. And there is a fairly large difference between women and men on this. Not to sort of negate the importance for women in suicide, of course, but why do you think men are more likely to take their own lives?
Yeah, and I really, really want to say thank you for opening this question and this topic up, mate, because as you say, it's a difficult one. It can be a confronting one to talk about, but yeah, it's exactly the same over here in Australia. The 8 to 9 sort of suicides every day, and the vast majority of those are men. There's a lot in behind this. Academically and medically, for example, we know that men are more likely to pass away from suicide because, for example, men are more likely to go without formal psychiatric or psychological support for all of those things we've already touched on. Men are more likely to stay quiet and not let people know they're struggling, and men are more likely to have a condition become severe and reach that potential point, whereas women are more likely to make an appointment, reach out for support from friends or family, see a psychiatrist or a psychologist. So that's involved here. We also know, and again, this is quite confronting, but we know from research that men are far more likely than women to take more lethal means of attempting suicide. And so there are a significant amount of men and women every day, unfortunately, attempting to take their own lives. But we know that women are more likely to attempt that via means that are less lethal or less likely to go forward. And men are more likely to take means or measures which are potentially higher in lethality. So, those are just two examples of why this is a complex thing to unpick for men. But, one of the reasons I love getting this stuff out there and talking about even topics like this, even the confronting, obviously devastating ones, is that part of this is men not presenting for help or not speaking out when they're really struggling. And so I think if we can even start to shift that a little bit, that is going to be a part of us tackling men's suicide, because you're right, it's a huge issue, and it still sort of shocks me. I remember sitting in a psychology lecture and having a shiver go down my spine when the lecturer read out that the most common cause of death for young men is suicide. And if you think about, well, physical illnesses, cancer, road traffic accidents, any other cause of young men dying, the number one cause is men taking their own lives. And that, to me, is just incredibly sad and gut-wrenching. And that is part of the reason why I actually wanted to become a psychiatrist, to be able to have a foot in the door with helping prevent that from happening. So, yeah, it's something that we really need to tackle.
Absolutely. Kieran, so we've really hashed out some meaty topics regarding mental health, but I'm mindful, and I think it would be negligent not to take this opportunity to try and give my listeners some actionable tips that they can take away from the conversation. So something tangible they can use in their daily lives from now. So let's take a situation. You have seen one of your friends is potentially struggling with their mental health. And we get asked this all the time. It can be really difficult for people to go and approach that person. So what is your best bit of advice, or how do we go about approaching these difficult conversations?
Yeah, no, and that is like such a good place to start, I think, because obviously it's the place that it all starts, right? I think if we're not talking about this stuff, like we've just kind of mentioned before, I think, there's no way for any of us to kind of start that process of getting help or recovering or feeling better. And so it's so important, whether it's a family member or a mate or even just a colleague or a gym buddy. Like, I think it's so important to at least extend the branch and extend, the hand to open that door. And I think people really worry that that's going to be met with awkwardness, or that person's not going to want to talk about it. And my view and advice is always that that's okay, in terms of like quitting smoking or so many other things we do in our lives, or maybe talk to others about. It's not always the first time that things kind of connect. And I think even if someone can feel that someone cares and is interested and wants to talk when they're ready, that in itself can make a huge difference. So I guess my first bit of practical advice here would be to not be afraid of broaching it. Don't be afraid of asking or putting that flare out to see how someone's doing, because there are a lot of myths that float around as well in terms of, maybe if we make someone talk about it, it's going to make it worse. I think for parents and teenagers particularly, there's been this really dangerous myth that if we ask about safety and suicide and self-harm thoughts, it's going to put those thoughts in someone's brain and make them more likely to do it. Research shows that's absolute rubbish. So I think the first practical pieces of advice is just to not be afraid to ask. And I get that this is difficult stuff and it can feel a bit awkward and messy and emotional, but we need to kind of push through it and ask. I guess on the practical sense, in terms of, people are probably listening and saying, okay, mate, that's fine, but how do we actually do that? I often talk about something called a diffuser. People might have, you probably have seen me, mate, rambling about this or ranting about it on Instagram and different places. But a diffuser is adding something within the discussion to kind of act as a little bit of an in-between, so that it can take some of the intensity and emotion out of that initial kind of question and discussion. And particularly for people who are not used to talking about their feelings, particularly for men who find it more difficult to open up about these things because of all those social pressures, this can be really helpful. So broaching the topic or asking someone how they're going while you're driving, for example, and you're side by side, that has a lot of research to show that it can actually make it easier. It might be when you're washing the dishes together at the end of the night. It might be while you're going for a light jog as a mate. If there's something kind of in the middle, and especially if that involves a physical kind of action and a little bit of a distraction, research actually shows that can help people open up and make it easier for them to start talking. And I think that's just because it makes it a little bit less kind of emotionally intense and full on for both sides initially. So I think if you're wanting to ask someone how they're doing, you're wanting to broach that talk about mental health, adding a diffuser and kind of having that as a bit of an in is a nice little practical piece of advice for kind of how to start that conversation.
The diffuser is a brilliant idea, and I think it makes a lot of sense really in terms of sort of the human psyche and how our brains work. And it just feels a lot less confrontational. If you've got something else to do, it feels a bit less intense because you're talking about something that is potentially very intense. In a different situation, so we have discussed a little bit about suicide today. And often we hear about these situations where people haven't mentioned at all that they are feeling low. And the end result, unfortunately, is that they've taken their own life. How do we do better at finding this in our friends and our loved ones, and how do we go about working out who are the right people to ask if there are no signs?
Yeah, yeah, and it can be a really, really difficult thing. I think, like we've just said, it's a difficult thing because it's a really scary thing. I think we need to acknowledge that as family members, friends, colleagues. It can be actually really emotional and scary for us to kind of feel that might be there in someone we love as well. So I think it's difficult because on both sides, it's obviously an incredibly, emotional, difficult, quite traumatic thing. And then, as you say, a lot of the time it can be missed because it's not something we talk about or bring up often, obviously, and it's not something that is easy to talk about either. I think kind of along the same lines of sort of what we've just said, mate, I think the key thing is to know that it's okay to ask, and it's actually really important to ask. It's really, really important for people to know that if you're asking that question, it doesn't increase the risk of that happening. And I do want to push that. All of our research shows if you are asking someone how they're doing, and if you're asking if they're safe or if they've had any thoughts of not wanting to be here anymore, you infinitely kind of reduce the risk of that happening by asking and reaching out compared to increasing the risk of it. And for a long time, this myth has been that if we get someone talking about it, it's going to increase the chance of something happening. And that's just not the case. So again, I think it would always be to just remember that you can ask, and we should be asking. And I think people worry around how to ask that. And obviously your job is not to be the psychiatrist or the psychologist in this scenario. So it can be as simple as asking someone if they're feeling safe, or it can be as simple as asking someone if they've, had any thought cross their mind about not wanting to be here anymore. I often like to lead into that question and those discussions by saying, it's actually really common for people who are in a really, really tough situation or who are struggling with low mood to have those thoughts come into their mind. So has that come up for you? And so I think if we can take some of the clinical kind of coldness out of this question and out of talking about suicide and self-harm, I think that can go a long way in making people feel more comfortable to ask, and equally, hopefully, back people more comfortable to open up about their safety and how they're feeling and whether that's there for them. So I think always just ask would be my main sort of piece there.
Yeah, and I think it's important to just take a minute to sort of understand why this happens and why people get to that point. And I think part of the problem with depression and why it's so hard to spot is the nature of what is happening in people's brains when they are depressed means that it's very difficult for them to open up to other people because they feel maybe an element of shame. They feel like they're a burden. And if they open up first, then they would be making the situation worse. And it's in their mind, it's more difficult to open up than it is to actually end up taking their own life. Yes. And that's a really difficult concept to get around in your mind, but that's as damaging as depression is on someone's brain. And so I guess what I would also add in terms of what you've illustrated there really nicely is kind of just making it a regular practice and normalizing mental health check-ins between sort of friends. A really good one I've got at the moment is I have a diary which has every week just a section that says friends I want to check in on. And what I've tried to make my sort of practice over the last couple of months is I'm going to check in on a certain couple of people or someone I haven't spoken to, and within that conversation I'm challenging myself to try and open up about mental health a little bit more and just see if they need any sort of support. And just making it that regular process and making it a habit, then will just, sort of extend into the rest of your life, hopefully.
Absolutely. And I love that so much, mate, because, that's what I was just going to add as well. I think it's normalizing these kind of discussions, and it's normalizing checking in, and it's normalizing making sure that safety or checking if someone's feeling safe is always a part of that, because I think, for sometimes understandable reasons, but, for a long time, I think suicide in society has been something that's just been so swept under the rug. And even within the media, for example, if someone passes away, it's never directly said or spoken about, but it's always kind of hinted at or inferred. And so I think on both sides, there can be this sense of shame. And this is something that we shouldn't be asking about or checking in about. But, it's actually incredibly common for people to have just thoughts of self-harm or suicide if they're going through a really tough time. And that doesn't mean that they're going to act on those thoughts, but, it's actually a lot more common than I think a lot of people assume. And so we need to be talking about it, checking in about it, just as you say, because that helps us catch things early. It helps people feel like it's out rather than in, and that goes such a long way to hopefully reducing some of those cases where people, as you say, Matt, they do bottle it up, feel like they can't talk about it or be honest about it. So yeah, absolutely. I love that check-in idea.
Smashing. So lastly, I want to sort of round off with what are your 3 biggest tips to keep your mental health strong, and what do you do for yourself?
Oh, these are always my favorite questions, because there's so many goodies to choose from in terms of options for people. But I guess if it's my favorite ones or things that I try and do myself, depending on the week at the hospital and what's going on in my life, I think sleep is a really, really important one. And that's something that I try and protect as best as I can. And for me personally, I notice that sleep is a huge factor in how I'm feeling mentally. And I think in society in general, we don't give it enough credit in terms of what it does for our mental health. So one of my favorites for how we can look after our mental health is actually to look after and prioritize our sleep. It can help our mood stay stable and regulated. It can help reduce anxiety. There are studies to show that sleep affects someone's risk of self-harm and suicide, for example. So it's a really kind of powerful mediating factor for protecting our mental health and for improving our mental health if we're struggling. So I try and aim for about 7 or 8 hours a night. And for 90 to 95% of the population, that's going to be the sweet spot. Some people will need more. We all know those annoying night owls that can get 5 and they still are like fresh as a daisy and doing fine. But I think if you can aim for around 7 for most people, that's a good sort of mark to hit. And then, just looking after the quality of your sleep. So trying to get off screens half an hour to an hour before, not having caffeine in the afternoon if you can help it, keeping alcohol kind of to just some days during the week. These things don't just give us longer sleep, they actually improve the quality of our sleep. So looking after sleep would be number 1. Probably my second favorite, probably no surprise, is physical activity and exercise. So I'm someone that is a bit of a gym nut. I love sport. I love fitness. So for me, that's something that just keeps me feeling mentally grounded across the week. And again, it's really exciting that modern medicine now shows that exercise and movement, even if it's walking or some Pilates or yoga, that does just as much for our mind and our mental health as it does for our heart and our lungs and our bone health and all these other things we've always been taught exercise is about. So I think if you can be having kind of 3 or 4 sort of points of movement and reasonable exercise during the week, that's really protective for your mental health. And probably my third one that I've been trying to do more of, even just recently, actually, is kind of along the lines of what you brought up there, mate, in terms of just trying to regularly schedule some check-in time with people. And that can benefit us just as much as it does those other people in our lives. And, I think one of the beautiful things about training to be a psychiatrist and then becoming a psychiatrist is personally, it's just shown me the power of even brief little moments of just feeling fully open and connected with people, and for people, and especially guys out there listening, that doesn't mean you have to be having like a massive D&M and spilling your guts every single week, but it might just be 1 or 2 points across the week where we're actively scheduling in time to just stop, catch up with someone, talk to them properly, where you're focusing just on the chat. You're not kind of doing 100 things at the same time, and where you feel you can even just outline how you're feeling that week or how your work week's going. We really underestimate the amount of kind of steam that can let off in our mind. Probably kind of regularly scheduling some active time for kind of social connection is probably my third tip. And I think if people are doing those 3 things and doing them well, it can go a long, long way towards kind of looking after and protecting our mental health like we do our body.
Such important foundations. And I think it can be really easy on the world of social media. There's so much information and people talking about the science of mental health and just health in general with biohacking and all this. And it can be easy to fall down rabbit holes and spend a long time doing other things and spending lots of money on other things. But, if you have to go back to basics before you do any of these extra fancy things on top. And just finally, I always round off with this question, and it's similar to what you've just answered. But if you were to have a patient or anyone listening, what is your single best advice that someone can do and take into their life to improve their health and happiness?
Look, I think it's, like you say, kind of similar to some of what I've just sort of spat out there before. But, I think one of the biggest things for looking after our mental health and also actually our physical health, in my biased opinion, obviously, it is just to really lean into that slightly corny line of vulnerability and authenticity is kind of that sweet spot for our mental health. And, I think, just as you said, mate, whether it's in medicine or outside of medicine, and it's online or in social media, I think there are so many bells and whistles in terms of medication and biohacking and all these new treatments and all of these complex things that might be amazing for a lot of people. But I think if we strip it all back, what psychiatry shows me every single day and what I love about it is that I think there's just so much power in feeling like you're being heard and feeling like you're able to express what's really going on inside and what you're really feeling. So I think if someone was asking me what is my take-home number 1 tip for looking after your health in general, what I would want to add to the pot would be, just leaning into being messy and vulnerable and feeling what you're feeling and not hiding from it or bottling it or ignoring it. Because there's just so much to be gained from getting that stuff out and feeling like, you're being heard as yourself. And that might be with a good mate, that might be with a family member, that might be with a psychologist or a psychiatrist. But I think, the whole better out than in thing is used for a lot of different things, usually stuff to do with our bowels rather than mental health. But, it's absolutely better out than in when it comes to kind of what we're feeling and thinking and things as well. So, I think people should just lean into that more in everyday life.
Fantastic. Kieran, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks so much for taking the time. The time difference has been difficult at times, but we've got through, and I think we've recorded some really good bits and bobs for people to help improve their health and their happiness. So thank you for joining me.
No, I hope so, mate. And thank you so much for having me and for persevering with our old London, Sydney time difference. But it's been a pleasure. So hope everyone enjoys.
Thanks, mate. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Straight Talking Doctor Pod. I hope you not only found this episode interesting, but also hopefully learned something that you can use to help improve your life. If you enjoyed the podcast, or even if you didn't, I'd be so grateful if you could go onto your streaming site and leave a 5-star review so that I can reach as many people as possible. Finally, if you have any feedback or suggestions for further guests, please get in touch with me at The Straight Talking Doctor on Instagram.